Delaney Brooks placed $1 million on the table in front of hundreds of shareholders, pointed at the silver prototype sitting silent in the center of the stage, and said to Weston Hale with absolute calm, "If you can start it, the money is yours." The room laughed. To everyone watching, Weston was just a single father in a worn jacket, a small-town mechanic brought in as a last resort after the entire engineering team had already failed. But when he walked toward that car, set his hand on the hood, and listened to the silence the engine was holding, the quiet smile he had carried in faded. The car was not broken. It was waiting for the man who had built its heart. Don't look away, because the first sound of that engine is about to expose a secret Delaney never knew she was keeping. The event had been months in the making, a night Brooks Meridian Motors had staked its credibility on, and every detail from the cascading stage lights to the marble-white press risers had been engineered to communicate one thing: this company was not dying. The Meridian Vesper 1 sat at the center of the main stage, draped in silver like a secret not yet ready to be told, its low silhouette cutting a line that even skeptics in the room admitted was beautiful, and Delaney Brooks had spent the better part of 6 months calling it her answer. The product that would silence the acquisition rumors, stabilize the board, and prove she was more than a founder's daughter keeping a legacy warm. 300 shareholders, a press pool hand-selected by Whitney Boone's communications team, and a cluster of investors whose patience had been thinning for 2 years, filled the hall with the specific tension of people who had come either to be impressed or to watch something collapse. The catering staff moved between tables with the practiced quiet of people paid to be invisible, and the lighting team on the rigging above made their final adjustments. And the only person in the building who felt no particular anticipation was Delaney herself, who had already decided the evening was going to go exactly as planned. She was not prepared for what happened next. The Vesper 1 was supposed to roll onto the main stage under its own power, a theatrical entrance designed to announce its battery-electric drivetrain without a single word being spoken. But instead, the car remained exactly where it had been parked 3 hours before the event. Motionless, its dashboard dark, its engine core returning nothing but error codes that the internal team had been cycling through for the better part of an hour. The engineers ran every diagnostic available. The onboard software returned a startup refusal at the mechanical authentication layer. The override commands bounced back without explanation, and the battery handshake was being blocked by a process no one in the current department recognized or could locate in any documentation. Garrett Holloway, positioned near the largest investor cluster before the trouble began, leaned toward a man named Preston Tate and said quietly that Delaney had always pushed timelines past their natural boundary. That ambition without control was a liability the board could not sustain. Cassidy Monroe was the one who brought up the name. She had been cross-referencing an archived memo from the early prototype phase and found a passing reference to a mechanical restoration specialist who had been consulted on the baseline of the engine's precursor system. A man named Weston Hale, who operated a one-person shop on the outskirts of Detroit and whose name appeared nowhere in the company's current documentation, in no org chart, in no vendor record, in no file that had been touched in years. Delaney listened with the impatience of someone running out of options and asked whether this person was actually qualified or whether Cassidy was describing a story she had told herself in a pressured moment. Then she authorized the call when Cassidy said there was nothing else on the table. Weston arrived 40 minutes later in a jacket that had seen better years, carrying a single canvas tool roll, and the moment he stepped into the loading corridor and saw the Vesper 1 under the stage lights, his pace slowed almost imperceptibly. The way a person slows when they recognize something they had not expected to see again. Several catering staff near the side corridor glanced at each other. Whitney Boone clocked him from across the room and said under her breath to her assistant that if the cameras caught this man standing next to a flagship prototype, they would spend the next week cleaning up the optics. Garrett watched Weston from a distance and said nothing, which was in its own way more revealing than anything he could have chosen to say. Delaney gave Weston the shortest possible briefing, asked directly whether he could start the car or not, and told him the time available for an answer was not generous. Weston looked at the Vesper One for a long moment, the kind of looking that contained something other than technical assessment. And then he said something that made Delaney's brow tighten in a way she noticed but did not immediately understand. He said he needed to hear it quiet first. Delaney did not know what that meant. She would before the night was over. The pressure Delaney carried that night was not the abstract kind described in business profiles. It was the specific, grinding weight of a company that had been profitable for 20 years, watching its own board lose faith in its future, and she had very little patience left for anything that resembled mystery. She asked Weston again, more directly, could he fix the car, yes or no, because she had 300 people in that hall, and a communications team with a script that was already 40 minutes behind schedule. Garrett Holloway stepped into the conversation before Weston could answer and said, in the courteous tone he used when he wanted to humiliate someone without raising his voice, that perhaps they should be realistic about what a restoration mechanic from the Detroit suburbs could actually contribute to a vehicle representing $47 million in development investment. He was not wrong about the amount, and everyone in earshot was meant to register it. Whitney added that having an unvetted external contractor standing next to the Vesper One, while press were still in the hall, was a brand liability she could not manage, and she said it the way people say things when they want the room to agree without being asked to vote. Several engineers from the internal team exchanged glances that Weston registered and chose not to react to. He had been in rooms like this before, rooms where the person with the least institutional authority was expected to feel it most acutely, and he had learned long ago that reacting to the atmosphere was the fastest way to lose the ground he had not yet claimed. He said, without looking at Garrett, that the Vesper One did not need additional software or an expanded diagnostic array. The car was refusing startup because it was missing a mechanical authentication sequence embedded in the core of the engine itself, not in any external system, not in anything the current team would find by running another cycle of the same protocols they had already exhausted. The lead engineer on the internal team responded with the specific dismissiveness of someone who had spent a decade believing that mechanical systems were a footnote in modern automotive design, and said that was an interesting theory for a car built on entirely modern architecture. Weston said that the engine they were looking at had not been built on entirely modern architecture, that it had been designed from the start to resist full software dependency, because the person who originally designed it had understood that the day might come when someone else would try to control what it was willing to start for. The room went quiet in a way that was different from the polite quiet of before. Delaney heard the sentence the way you hear something that lands at a slightly wrong frequency, familiar enough to locate but wrong enough to require attention. She stepped forward, picked up a leather portfolio from the presentation table beside the stage, and removed a check that had been prepared as part of the event's promotional theater, $1 million, intended as a symbolic guarantee of the Vesper One's capabilities during the night's scripted presentation. And she set it on the table in front of Weston and the full room and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, if he started this car, it was his. If he could not, then she would like him to stop using the word mechanic as a credential and leave her event. Weston looked at the check for 1 second. He looked at Delaney for a second longer, and then he said, with the evenness of someone who has made his decision well in advance of the moment that requires it. I didn't come here for the money. I came because that car should not be in the hands of people who don't know what it is. Delaney's jaw tightened and she held his gaze without blinking, and the security detail at the edge of the stage shifted almost imperceptibly forward, and she decided that the fastest way to end this particular disturbance was to let him try and fail publicly, because failure was a thing she knew how to manage, and whatever this man was doing was something she could not yet name. Weston walked to the Vesper One and opened the hood. What Weston saw when the hood came up was not what the engineering team had been diagnosing all evening, and it was not what the press materials described when they called the Vesper One a fully original platform. The outer architecture was modern: the battery management housing, the cooling channels, the integration harness. But the structural core of the engine, the component geometry that determined how everything else spoke to everything else, carried the unmistakable signature of a much older design, something that had been built not from a current specification sheet but from the intuition of a specific person who thought about engines the way other people think about language. Weston recognized it the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in years, immediately and without any process of deliberate reasoning, and for a moment he stood completely still. He found the junction he was looking for near the secondary ignition cluster, a small mechanical assembly that had no label in the current documentation because it had been carried forward from a system that was never supposed to exist anymore. He had placed it there himself, 12 years earlier, during a prototype development phase that the company had subsequently buried in a restricted archive. It was not a software lock or a cryptographic password. It was a mechanical verification loop requiring a specific sequence of thermal, pressure, and rotational inputs before the engine would commit to a full startup cycle, and the sequence had been designed to be unreplicable without knowing the original design intent. Weston and Tessa had called it a signature because that was exactly what it was, the technical equivalent of handwriting. He asked the room to shut down every external diagnostic device and monitoring system currently attached to the vehicle. The lead engineer protested, citing protocols required for any active demonstration event, and Delaney looked at her watch and said to let him proceed because she wanted this resolved in the next 5 minutes regardless of outcome. The hall went quieter as secondary systems dropped away, and in the new silence the Vesper One sat under the stage lights with a quality that the people in the room later struggled to describe accurately. Weston reached into his canvas roll and removed a single analog calibration instrument that had not been standard issue in any automotive workshop for at least a decade, adjusted a primer valve, reversed a sensor coupling that had been installed backwards by someone who did not know the orientation mattered, and then laid his hand flat against the engine block. Garrett Holloway, watching from stage left with his arms folded, felt something shift in his stomach that he chose not to examine. Weston inserted a test key. The first attempt produced a single dry click that drew low laughs from the edges of the hall and made Whitney Boone exhale in a way she later denied was relief. The second attempt brought the instrument cluster to life, every gauge lighting and holding steady in a configuration the engineers had not seen all evening, and the third attempt brought the engine up in a way that no one in the room was prepared for, a deep, low, resonant sound that seemed to rise from somewhere below the floor of the building and fill the entire space with a physical pressure that made people in mid-conversation stop and turn. The central display panel lit with a single line of text that had not appeared in any documentation, any rehearsal walkthrough, or any communications brief in the months of preparation leading up to this night. Engine origin, Sekink recognized. Delaney stared at the screen. The engineering team had no explanation. Cassidy Monroe, standing at the edge of the stage with her tablet, opened a folder and began moving very quickly. Weston looked at the words on the display for a long moment, and his face carried nothing that resembled triumph or satisfaction, nothing that resembled winning. He said, quietly enough that only the people immediately around him could hear, they still couldn't scrub all of it. The room came back to life the way crowds do after witnessing something they do not entirely understand, with noise, with motion, with people performing enthusiasm they hoped would pass for comprehension. Several shareholders near the front began to applaud, reading the moment as a dramatic flourish engineered by the communications team, a piece of scripted theater designed to recover from the earlier delay and give the evening something to remember. Whitney Boone was at Delaney's elbow within 30 seconds, speaking quietly and rapidly about the narrative opportunity, the discovery story, the unexpected hero, the CEO who found talent in the margins, and she was already building a press angle before the engine had completed its startup cycle. Delaney picked up the check and walked toward Weston in the manner she used in every room she entered, as though the situation had already been categorized and a resolution selected. She held out $1 million in front of 300 people and said the bet was settled and the money was his. Weston did not reach for it. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the particular steadiness of a person who has already decided that what comes next matters more than what just happened. And he said the car had not started because of anything he had done in the last 10 minutes. He said it had started because it recognized an origin sequence from the engine that had originally been designed into it. A sequence that should not exist in this vehicle if the company's documented history of the platform was accurate. He said the Vesper One was not entirely original technology. Its core, the mechanical heart that determined how it thought about starting and running and refusing, was a direct evolution of an engine system called Project Hearthline, developed, shelved, and stripped of its recorded authorship more than a decade ago. The applause stopped. The hall shifted. Garrett moved fast. He stepped toward the stage and said loudly that this was exactly the kind of claim made by people with clear financial motivation to disrupt high-value transactions, and that a mechanic who had just been offered a life-changing sum and declined it was not demonstrating principle but strategy. He was good at this, at making the obvious interpretation sound like the obvious interpretation, at making the crowd feel that common sense was on his side. And it nearly worked. Then Cassidy Monroe said Delaney's name once, quietly, and held up her tablet. She had found a restricted archive folder, flagged as legacy documentation, containing a subfolder that had never been transferred to the active documentation system. She had not opened it yet, but its label was visible and it read, Hearthline, WB, WH, TH, Access Restricted. Delaney looked at those letters and went very still. She announced a 15-minute technical hold, said it without elaboration in a tone that closed the subject, and walked toward the back corridor with Weston and Cassidy before Garrett could find the right move to stop her. In the private room behind the stage, under fluorescent light, with no cameras and no shareholders, and no check on the table between them, Delaney asked who Weston was. He said, "The person who built the engine you just bet $1 million I couldn't start." He told her it began 12 years ago. Not in a boardroom, but in a converted warehouse on the south side of Detroit that Warren Brooks had leased as a skunkworks facility for a small team of engineers he trusted more than his formal research and development department. Weston had not come to that team through any conventional path. No prestigious degree program, no recruiting pipeline, no credential that would have impressed the people filling the hall outside. He had come because Warren Brooks had attended a demonstration of a small marine propulsion system. Weston had rebuilt from salvaged components, spent 40 minutes afterward asking questions no one else at that event had thought to ask, and made a call 2 days later that changed the direction of both their lives. Warren believed the future of engine design was not in raw performance metrics, but in what he called mechanical honesty, the capacity of a system to know what it actually was, to operate within its real parameters rather than the parameters it had been marketed on, and to resist manipulation from outside its intended architecture. Weston was the person who knew how to build that quality into physical metal, into tolerances and geometries and component relationships that were not visible in any specification sheet, but that determined everything about how the machine behaved under pressure. He worked alongside a woman named Tessa, who at the time was a data systems engineer contracted to the project and who approached the problem from the opposite direction. Where Weston gave the engine its structure, Tessa gave it its memory, designing the layered verification sequences that allowed the system to carry its own origin forward through any modification or rebranding. What they built together was called the Hearthline Core, a hybrid mechanical-electric architecture that could self-verify its startup authorization and detect interference. And Warren Brooks intended it to form the foundation of a vehicle line that would remain independent of the external investment pressures he could already see reshaping the industry. He believed that if you built a car that knew where it came from, you protected not only the technology, but the people who had created it. The project ran for 2 years, produced 3 working prototypes, and was still in active development when Warren Brooks died unexpectedly of a cardiac event while traveling. Within 6 months of his death, the official record of Hearthline was closed. The project declared a failure due to technical insufficiency, and the names of the engineers who had worked on it were removed from every document that remained in the company's accessible files. Weston left the industry not long after, not because he had been forced out, but because Tessa had become ill, and he chose to be with her until she was gone. And after she was gone, there was no version of returning to a company that had treated her contribution as something that could be deleted from the record, as though she had never been there. He became a restoration specialist, raised his daughter in the quiet that follows a life rerouted, and had not spoken the name Hearthline to anyone in years until Cassidy Monroe called and said a car could not start. Delaney listened to all of it without interrupting, and the expression on her face moved through configurations. She would not have allowed herself in front of a camera. She was not a person who made room easily for the possibility that the thing she believed she owned had a history she did not know. And yet the file label on Cassidy's tablet was still visible from across the table, and the letters WB were her father's initials, and WH were this man's, and TH was a woman who had apparently understood, years before it happened, that someone would try to pretend she had never existed. Cassidy said quietly that the restricted folder had last been accessed by a system credential belonging to Garrett Holloway's administrative account, approximately 3 weeks before tonight's event was publicly announced. Delaney set both hands flat on the table and asked Cassidy to get Vaughn Mercer on the phone. Vaughn Mercer was already in the building. Weston had called him from the loading corridor before he ever touched the hood of the Vesper 1, because the moment he had recognized that engine's silhouette from across the stage, he had understood that the night was unlikely to end with a simple repair and a handshake, and because Vaughn was the person who had spent 12 years maintaining a paper trail that Weston had never expected to need. While Delaney processed what she had just heard, Cassidy completed her review of the restricted archive and assembled a timeline that made the situation considerably worse than it had already appeared. The Vesper 1 had not arrived through independent innovation. Garrett Holloway had, over the course of 4 years in his role as Chief Strategy Officer, overseen a development pathway that reverse-engineered the documented elements of the Hearthline core, specifically the components included in original patent filings that Warren Brooks had submitted before his death, which were a matter of public record if you knew where to look, and used them as the structural foundation for a new platform presented to the board, to investors, and to the press as an original proprietary system. The distinction mattered enormously because the intellectual property chain of the Hearthline core had never been formally resolved after Warren Brooks died, which meant that the rights existed in a legal gray zone that a careful reading of the original documentation would complicate substantially. Garrett had known this. He had not only known it, he had designed the Vesper One's commercial launch around it specifically because the deal he had in negotiation with Preston Tate's investment group required the transfer of the core engine technology as part of the transaction, and the deal could only close if that technology was represented as unencumbered proprietary property belonging to Brooks Meridian. A separate document in the same restricted folder referenced an arrangement that would benefit Garrett personally after the transaction was complete. But the trap had a second jaw, and Weston laid it out for Delaney plainly. If the car had failed to start that night, Garrett's story was that Delaney had staked the company's future on a vehicle that was not ready, a failure of judgment justifying the emergency board motion he had already drafted, requesting a temporary transfer of executive authority. If the car started and someone like Weston was the one who started it, Garrett's story was that Delaney had concealed the true origins of the technology and allowed a questionable third-party access to a flagship asset. Either outcome, either version of the evening, led to the same result. Delaney removed from her position before the quarterly review. Whitney Boone had prepared both versions in writing, 2 press statements, 2 narrative frameworks, 2 sets of talking points. One describing a catastrophic launch failure, one describing a CEO who had misrepresented her company's technology to investors. Cassidy found them both in a draft folder on the shared communications server, either because Whitney had been careless or because she had not believed anyone would ever look for them. Weston told Delaney that the only move that broke both arms of the trap simultaneously was for her to speak first, to take control of the public record before Garrett could shape it, because a story told by the person who made the mistake was fundamentally different from the same story told by the person who intended to profit from it. Delaney said nothing for a long time. Then Garrett knocked on the door and said the hall was restless and the delay needed to end, and the certainty in his voice belonged to a person who was sure he had already won. Delaney stood up. She smoothed her jacket, picked up her portfolio, and walked back toward the stage in a way that Garrett correctly read as purposeful but misread as compliance, because he had watched Delaney operate long enough to believe he could predict what she would do when cornered. He believed she would protect the company's image the way she always had. By containing the disruption, by managing the optics, by choosing the version of events that kept the most people in their seats. He was wrong in a way that would cost him everything, but he did not know that yet. Delaney stepped to the center of the stage and said, in the even, precise voice she used when she wanted every word recorded correctly, that the Meridian Vesper One had started successfully and that she was proud of what that vehicle represented. She let the room settle around that sentence. And then she said that the commercial portion of the evening was being postponed, because before Brooks Meridian moved forward with any transaction tied to this technology, the company would conduct a full independent review of the platform's technical origins, and that review would be made available to shareholders, to the press, and to any independent technical authority that chose to examine it. The hall did not know how to respond. Whitney Boone stood at the side of the room with both hands on her tablet and the expression of someone watching a building they designed fall down. Garrett moved toward the stage and was stopped by Cassidy Monroe, who stepped into his path and held up the tablet showing the 2 draft press statements, and said with quiet professionalism that he was welcome to explain to the room how he had prepared 2 versions of tonight's story in advance. Delaney invited the independent technology audit firm present in the hall. They had attended as guests of a shareholder group that had been growing skeptical of Brooks Meridian's platform claims, to examine the startup data alongside the company's own records. She then invited Weston to speak to the audience, not as an adversarial party but as a person with direct knowledge of how the engine had originally been designed and what its startup sequence represented. Weston did not use the moment as a platform. He had no interest in performing grievance for an audience. And what he said was brief and without drama, that an engine, like any system built by a human being, carries its history inside it, and that when someone changes the name or the housing or the story around that engine, the engineering itself does not forget where it came from. It was not a legal argument. It was not an accusation. It was true, and the room responded to it with the particular stillness that follows something true. Cassidy put the old data on the main display: the Hearthline core documentation, the project identifiers, the 3 initial filing that linked Warren Brooks, Weston Hale, and Tessa Holloway in the same technical lineage as the engine that had just started in front of 300 witnesses. Several engineers who had been with the company long enough to remember the period when Hearthline existed as a project name went very still. Garrett attempted once more to intervene, calling the data unverified. Delaney said that because it was unverified, no transaction involving the Vesper One's technology would be signed that night, and the room understood that the CEO had chosen something other than the easy version of the story. Garrett's pivot was smooth and built on everything he had been saying since Weston walked through the loading corridor. That this man was a financial opportunist, that a single father with a modest income and a small declining business had appeared at a moment of corporate vulnerability with a story calibrated to extract maximum value, and that declining $1 million on a public stage was not a gesture of integrity but a tactical move designed to make the next number seem reasonable. He said it in the measured, concerned tone of a person protecting the organization rather than attacking the individual, which was the version of the argument he had used throughout his career because it was the hardest to disagree with out loud. Weston walked to the table where the check was sitting, picked it up, and placed it in front of Delaney without speaking. Then he said, "I'm not holding this to trade for silence, and I'm not using it to prove a point. The point was proven when the engine started. The second time a person declines $1 million in the same evening, the room pays attention differently than the first, and the room paid attention." Von Mercer came through the side entrance carrying a document case containing materials he had spent 12 years keeping current. The files included the original patent application Warren Brooks had filed before his death, listing the 3 primary contributors to the Hearthline core architecture, a series of technical notebooks kept by Tessa Holloway during the development period, written in her own hand with dates and version numbers and the specific problem-solving notation she used when working through new approaches, and a formal letter submitted to the company's legal department 4 years after Warren Brooks died, on behalf of Weston's interests that had never received a formal response. Delaney held the patent filing and read the contributor list in silence. Her father's name was first, Weston Hale's name was second, Tessa Holloway's name was third, with a notation identifying her contribution as the origin sequence memory architecture, the precise mechanism that had just displayed itself on the Vesper One's central screen. Vaughn opened one of the technical notebooks to a section near the back, where Tessa had written a note in the margin describing the sequence verification system. The note said that if the engine was ever renamed, or the record of its origin was ever erased, the verification layer would carry the original sequence forward, regardless, because the whole point of building memory into a system was to make sure that memory could not be taken from the people who had put it there. Delaney read it twice and did not speak for a moment. A man named Mitchell Dawson raised his hand from the middle of the hall. He was 62, had been with Brooks Meridian for 28 years, and said in a steady voice that he had been present at 2 of the Hearthline core test sessions and had heard Warren Brooks say, on more than one occasion, that Hearthline was the actual future of the company, not marketing language, but a technical conviction. He said he had not spoken about it since the project was closed because the person who told him never to mention it again had been Garrett Holloway. He said he was speaking now because there were things he was tired of staying quiet about. The Vesper One continued running beside them, its engine turning in the deep rhythm it had found when it first started, and it was no longer a product demonstration but something closer to what it had always actually been. A record. The emergency session convened on the building's 4th floor in a conference room booked by Cassidy Monroe within minutes of Delaney's announcement, and the people who took their seats understood that the evening's agenda had been overtaken by something that could not be managed with a press statement. Garrett arrived with his legal counsel and a printed copy of the board motion he had prepared. A formal request for temporary transfer of executive authority on the grounds that Delaney had failed to maintain control of a strategically critical asset, and he placed it on the table at the session's opening as though it were routine documentation rather than the culmination of months of preparation. Delaney did not dispute the sequence of events. She acknowledged that she had turned a launch event into something unexpected, that the public nature of what had unfolded represented real reputational exposure, and that this was her responsibility. She said the alternative, proceeding with the commercial transaction as planned, knowing what she now knew about the technology's origin and the unresolved intellectual property chain, would have been a different kind of exposure, the kind that did not arrive as a difficult evening, but as a federal investigation. Cassidy presented 3 items in sequence: the original patent filing and Von Mercer's supporting documentation confirming that the Hearthline Core's intellectual property chain included parties whose interests had never been addressed in any agreement. Brooks Meridian had executed since Warren Brooks's death the terms of the proposed transaction with Preston Tate's group, which included a representation that the Vesper One platform was entirely proprietary and unencumbered, and the 2 pre-prepared press statements from Whitney Boone's communications files, which Cassidy presented without narration, because the documents explained themselves. The board chairman asked Garrett to speak to the press statements. Garrett said they were contingency materials, that preparing multiple versions of a communications response was standard practice for high-stakes events. The chairman asked why one version described Delaney as having concealed the true origin of the company's core technology. Garrett said it was precautionary framing for a scenario that had not occurred. The chairman asked when the scenario had been anticipated. Garrett said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. Vaughn spoke to the legal exposure clearly. If the transaction had been executed that evening, Brooks Meridian would have sold the rights to a technology system containing intellectual property from contributors whose interests had been excluded from every agreement the company had made on the subject for more than a decade, and the resulting litigation would not be measured in months. He said the simplest defensible path forward was a complete audit of the Hearthline documentation, a formal resolution of the intellectual property claims, and full disclosure to shareholders, not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only version of events that did not eventually get worse. Garrett said the company could not be held hostage to the memories of a dead man and a mechanic who had shown up uninvited to a corporate event. The words were controlled, but the temperature behind them was not, and in the responding silence, Delaney understood that she was watching a person who had believed, until perhaps an hour ago, that he had already won. She said the company her father built was built by people exactly like Weston Hale, not by people who knew how to sell what those people created and then erase their names from the record. The board voted 3 items. Suspend the Tate transaction pending full intellectual property review. Open an independent audit of all Hearthline documentation and derivative platforms. And remove Garrett Holloway from all roles with authority over technical assets, pending separate investigation into his restricted folder access and pre-prepared communications. The vote was not close. Whitney Boone was placed on administrative suspension and asked to surrender all device access before leaving the building. Weston was not in the room. He had remained in the corridor outside, sitting near the water station, because the outcomes being decided beyond that door were not his to vote on. He had one investment in the night's proceedings, specific and uncomplicated. He wanted to know whether the people in that room would do for Tessa what they had not done when she was alive. When Delaney came through the door, she found him still sitting, and she stopped and said, "I will not let them erase her a second time." They met again 2 days later in the testing garage where the Vesper 1 had been placed under formal documentation review, sealed from public access, its engine still carrying the sequence that had changed the course of a corporate evening. There were no shareholders, no press team, no check on a table between them, no audience for any version of this conversation. The overhead lights were industrial and indifferent, and the space smelled of metal and insulation, and it was, in that way, a setting that suited them both. Delaney told Weston she was sorry for the wager she had made in front of 300 people. She did not frame it as a misunderstanding or a strategic error. She said she had used money, the way she had been trained to, as the fastest shorthand for a person's worth, and that what she had done on that stage was offer a sum designed to establish her authority over the situation rather than to resolve it. She said she had been wrong. Weston did not absorb this as vindication. He said that money itself was a neutral instrument, and that the damage that night had not come from the amount but from the assumption behind it, the belief that a large enough number could locate the floor of a person's dignity. He said that assumption was not unique to Delaney. He had encountered it in many forms across his career, and he was not cataloging the offenses of powerful people when he said so, only noting that the assumption was common enough to be worth recognizing. Delaney asked whether he had felt bitterness toward Brooks Meridian in the years since he left. Weston said he had felt something closer to grief, that leaving the work he had cared about most was a loss that sat differently from the kind caused by anger, and that what had kept it manageable was the small shop and the rebuilding and the fact that engines did not care about institutional politics. He said the car starting that night had not felt like victory so much as confirmation, that things built with enough integrity tended to carry that integrity forward even when other people tried to redirect it. Delaney asked whether he was willing to take any formal role going forward. Weston said he would take a consulting arrangement on a single condition, which was not about compensation. He said the Hearthline documentation needed to be restored to full accessibility in the company's internal records. Every name on the original patent filing needed to be formally reinstated in the technical lineage of any derivative platform, and no part of his family's history was to be used in any public communications without his explicit written approval for each specific use. Delaney agreed to all 3 without negotiating. There was a moment then that both of them would remember differently, the way consequential moments tend to be remembered differently by the people who share them. Delaney placed her hand on the body of the Vesper 1 and said she had always thought of this car as something she owned. Weston looked at it for a moment before he answered, and he said, "No, you're just learning what it means to deserve what it remembers." The announcement came 5 weeks later. Brooks Meridian was formally suspending all commercial transactions tied to the Vesper 1 platform and reopening Project Hearthline under independent audit, with full public disclosure of the technology's development history to follow. The communications were prepared carefully by a new team Delaney had brought in to replace Whitney Boone's department, and they were factual rather than promotional, describing what had happened and what the company intended to do, rather than attempting to frame the situation as a triumph. The market's response was volatile for the first 2 weeks, which was the response Delaney had predicted and accepted. Then something shifted. Engineers who had been following the story, people working in automotive development, in battery systems, in propulsion research, began making public statements about the significance of the Hearthline architecture, about the design philosophy it represented, about what it meant that a company had voluntarily paused a major transaction to resolve an intellectual property question it might have been able to argue past for years. Institutional investors who prioritized governance sent signals they were watching closely. The share price stabilized. Garrett Holloway's situation did not stabilize. The investigation into his administrative account activity confirmed that he had accessed the Hearthline restricted archive multiple times before the launch event, removed filings from the active server to an archive path requiring elevated clearance, and circulated draft transaction documents to Preston Tate's legal team before any board approval had been sought. The conversation about what that constituted legally was ongoing, and Weston had no particular desire to follow it closely. Whitney Boone resigned before the administrative review reached her department's files, which did not prevent the review from proceeding. Weston took the consulting role and spent the majority of his hours in the testing facility rather than in any office, working with a cohort of junior engineers who had come up entirely in the software-first era of automotive development, and who had, in many cases, never been taught to listen to an engine the way Weston meant when he used that phrase. He taught them to understand the mechanical history embedded in a design, to read the decisions that previous engineers had made not from documentation alone, but from the geometry and tolerances and weight distribution of the physical components themselves. Several of them described the experience, in the understated way of people who work with machines, as changing how they thought about their jobs. The formal intellectual property resolution took 8 weeks. When it was complete, Tessa Holloway's name was restored to every document in the Hearthline chain, listed in her correct capacity as the architect of the Origin Sequence memory system. A new testing facility within the Brooks Meridian campus was designated the Holloway Origin Lab, a name chosen because it described what the space was for. Understanding where things came from and why that mattered. The plaque was small, placed at eye level, without ceremony, because that was how Weston had asked for it. Delaney attended the installation and said one thing that was recorded not by her office but by someone in the room who felt it should be heard, that a company cannot call itself a future if that future was built by erasing the names of the people who created it. Weston stood at the back of the room with the particular quiet of a person for whom the moment is large enough that adding words to it would only diminish it. He had not come for recognition. He had come because the plaque had Tessa's name on it, and he wanted to see it in place. 1 year after the night of the interrupted launch, Brooks Meridian held a second public event for the Vesper 1, smaller than the first, held not in a convention hall with staged lighting but in the company's main testing facility, where the floor was concrete and the guests were engineers, historians, longtime employees, and investors who had stayed through the difficult months because they believed the company was worth the difficulty. The car at the center of the space was the original prototype, the same vehicle that had refused to start for an engineering team and then started for the man it recognized, and it bore a designation plate added since most people in that room had last seen it. Hearthline, Core, Brooks, Hale, and Holloway. Delaney spoke briefly. She said that the last time she had stood next to this vehicle before an audience, she had placed $1 million on a table and told a single father in a worn jacket that if he could start it, the money was his. She said she had been wrong about what that moment was. She had read it as a test of competence when it was a test of character, and she had failed the character portion in a way she was still working to understand the full dimensions of. She said the bet had been the worst investment of her professional life and the most valuable thing that had happened to her understanding of what her father had actually been trying to build. Weston had been asked to speak and kept it to 4 sentences, which was the number he needed and no more. He said he had not started the car that night to win a wager. He said he had started it because a machine built with integrity will carry that integrity forward regardless of what name is placed on the outside of it. He said the people who built things that lasted did so because they cared about the building more than the credit, and the best tribute to that kind of person was to make sure the building remained visible. He stopped there and stepped back, and the room let him. Delaney had made one more decision about the original $1 million check, which had been sitting in her portfolio since the night of the launch, without ever being deposited or destroyed. She had converted it into the founding endowment for a technical scholarship program administered through the Brooks Meridian Foundation, available to engine mechanics, apprentice engineers, restoration specialists, and automotive technicians, people without conventional credentials but with the specific kind of knowledge that got things running when everything else had failed. The program was named for Tessa Holloway, whose belief, recorded in her own notebooks, was that the people who truly understood how systems worked were rarely the people who got to speak in rooms where decisions were made, and that this was the most correctable problem in any industry that wanted to build things that lasted. Weston was asked at the reception how it felt to have declined $1 million. He considered the question for a moment, looking through the facility windows at the Hearthline core engine running steadily behind its glass panel, turning over in the low, deep rhythm that had filled a convention hall 1 year ago and made 300 people stop and listen. He said, $1 million can buy the silence of most people in most rooms, but it cannot purchase the moment when a truth that has been waiting long enough finally gets heard. The testing facility filled with the engine's sound one more time as the evening wound down. Not the sound of a scandal being managed or a wager being settled, but the sound of a design that had been built to remember where it came from and had held that memory through every attempt to erase it. The same deep, quiet signal that had been waiting on the night Delaney Brooks set a check on a table and pointed at the silver car for the man who had built its heart.